Standard trademark disclaimers, software bill of materials. I'm going to try to avoid a formal definition at this point, but the idea is what is in the software and where does it come from is the basic question we're trying to answer with an SBOM, a software bill of materials. This generally is considered to mean the contents of the source code and, of course, where it came from, and then the various dependencies that make up deliverables. There's some gray area in terms of when dependencies are included or not included. Generally, these describe licenses and copyright, and I say vulnerabilities. There is a means to track whether there are known vulnerabilities against content. My expectation is these would be used primarily to identify content after that uses content with discovered vulnerabilities. There's basically three kinds of SBOMs as far as we're aware, and based on, again, observation of what the industry is doing and our own observations. Repository SBOM describes the contents of a repository, and that may or may not be the same as the contents of a build or the content of a product. When engaged in a build, we will very often build being a different type of SBOM, describing the content that goes into a build. Just because something goes into a build doesn't necessarily mean it's in a product. These are all, there are going to be cases. My expectation is this is going to be one of those 80-20 rules where 80% of the time these are all very, very similar, but there's going to be all sorts of cases where they are very, very different. Again, so a product SBOM would be a software bill of materials for content included in an actual product, a deliverable, what we refer to very often as a binary. Your build scripts, your Maven build script pulls in some content, some subset or some portion of that content winds up into the product. And then the repository tends to have all sorts of extra stuff. There may be testing code, there may be other sorts of things in there that don't wind up in the product. The repository may reference content. It's not in the repository itself, but references content that's used in builds and eventually possibly put in to products. Anyway, again, my point here is that there's a number of different ways of thinking about this, and there's really no necessarily any hierarchy of them. Again, not necessarily the case that one informs another. I'm primarily mostly familiar with SPDX. SPDX, we've been using in our license headers SPDX codes for years now, and that actually winds up having an awful lot of value. It certainly makes automatic scanning of content a lot easier, and understanding the licenses of content using automation when the SPDX license identifier is provided. This certainly helps us with identifying the intention of the developer. Very often scanning results in a variety of quality in scan results. There's also some weird things, like the dash license tool itself has a lot of test code that references a whole bunch of licenses, but the content is not distributed under any of those licenses. So understanding the difference between there being a mention of a license versus something actually being distributed under a license is a powerful concept all of its own. Of course, SPDX has a list of licenses and standardized codes for each of them. Again, extremely valuable from our point of view. But SPDX is so much more than that. They have this whole document description, a way of describing SBOMs. I'm showing here an example of an SBOM expressed in a YAML file format. Oh, hi, Tracy. SPDX also has a means of expressing it in other ways: tag value, JSON, RDF, which is an XML-based format. Again, I don't actually have a lot of familiarity with Cyclone DX. It does the same sort of things. There's considerable overlap, as I understand it. We actually do have a couple of projects that are doing work with Cyclone DX, and I do need to investigate that further. The Dash, just talk a little bit more about some of the technologies again that we're exploring. The Dash licenses tool does not generate an SPDX. Or any standard form of SBOM. It does generate a dependencies file. The idea here is to have a list of all of the dependencies. This is generally third-party content along with license information. When we built this, we were solving a particular problem. We believe that this could be used to feed into a solution where we're generating actual SBOMs in a standard format. One of the key aspects of this tool is that it allows us to gather actual curated license information about content and provides a means of initiating that curation. One of the things, one of the limitations, of course, is it is focused entirely on third-party content, so it doesn't do anything with actual project content. There are tools that do things with project content, so perhaps there's some kind of hybrid solution that might be realized here. We have been investigating in something called the OSS Review Toolkit, or ORT. Again, our primary focus with this has been to help us with intellectual property scans, basically implement our IP due diligence process using as much automation as possible. Our hope with this, and experiments are showing good results, our hope is that this tool is continuously scanning our repositories. And from that, again, it gathers up information about the licenses of the content in the repositories. It also discovers references to other content. So it recognizes POM files, it recognizes package lock files and cargo lock files and all those kinds of things, and uses that information to go and find third-party content. It leverages curated license information. It has its own built-in scanners. So it tries to build a fairly complete model of the software as it's described in a repository. And then from there, it does generate SBOMs in SPDX and Cyclone DX format. I would categorize these as repository SBOMs. So they're describing the contents of a repository, not necessarily the contents of any particular product or any particular build described within that repository. One of the things that we're experimenting with on top of all of it is integrating something called a license compatibility matrix from OSADL. The idea is the ORT is extremely good at identifying licenses and then overlaying it with OSADL to determine if the combination of licenses, using as much automation as possible, does a combination of licenses make sense? And again, our early experiments are pretty successful. Right now, on whole, the whole ORT, our tool chain generates. It's far too conservative right now. It identifies all sorts of things that our manual curation, our typical curation processes don't consider to actually be problems. So we're working on that. Anyway, I'll save talking too much about this particular tool for another time. Again, we're pretty excited about it. Reuse is something that a handful of our projects have been experimenting with. One of the very cool things about this is it provides a means of specifying license and copyright information for the entirety of a repository. So very often we wind up with repositories that contain artifacts like JSON files or image files or other other files for which providing license information directly in the file is difficult. Reuse provides a means of doing that. There's a reference here to the dep5 file, which is a format that the Debian folks have come up with that is leveraged here. Reuse has a linter that and actually has some tools for providing information that's missing. It also has a way of generating an SPDX. It's based entirely on the contents of a repository. It has no sense for packages that are referenced by any code. Again, this would be more a repository level SBOM or that it generates. SPDX folks generate some Maven plugins. They are actively maintained, which is good. They are based on package references. They use the Maven reactor to determine what libraries are referenced by a particular build, and then based on that, it can build an SBOM. Again, incomplete. It's based entirely on the list of dependencies that are discovered by the Maven reactor, not the project content itself. It also can only get license and copyright information as it is expressed in the POM files, which my experience has been that information is not consistently captured across Maven components, and our experience has been that it's generally useful. In many ways, it exactly expresses the developer's intention. Sometimes we discover licenses that maybe they hadn't accounted for in their license information. But anyway, so again, this doesn't leverage. What I'm getting at is this doesn't actually leverage curated information. The Eclipse SBOM project, interesting project, leverages class loaders in Java to generate from a running Java system a list of all of the content that is actually loaded by the running system. So, and then from that generates an SBOM based on that running system. If you understand anything about how Java works, this is actually, it's a pretty interesting thing. Except that it only keeps track of what gets loaded. There may be additional things on the class path that don't get loaded during an execution because you don't touch those areas. It does not include license or copyright information. It really only includes it does do a good job of identifying the things that are actually used. This might actually be a fourth class of SBOM. We have repository build and run and product SBOMs. This is kind of the runtime SBOM, I guess. I see this as an interesting tool for validating perhaps what we're actually doing at runtime. I haven't had enough time to really experiment with this to see where it actually fits in a in a SBOM generation story. I've been a little remiss in my responsibilities with this group, the Omnibor, which is formally referred to as GitBOM. If you've been on any of these calls before, you've likely heard me reference this. I find this to be fascinating technology. The idea is they are specifying a means by which, as a compiler, as a linker, as a build software, as things are built, a fingerprint of the things that are used to build the element is retained. So the idea is when a compiler runs, it keeps the SHA of the source files that were used to generate the object file, and then the linker keeps a fingerprint, the SHA of the object files that it had combined to build an executable. For example, that's the example that they use. It's I think it's a lot easier to think about in a C and C++ context than in other languages. We might, in Java, the Java compiler would embed a SHA of the source, the Java sources, a jar file. I'm not sure how this even makes any sense yet. Might, in its metadata, specify the SHA of the Java classes that are used, that it embeds, and so forth. Other examples. But the idea is that tool builders would modify their tools to include minimal information about the source of things. And then we wind up in their grand vision, we wind up in a world where, given some artifact, we have a means of tracing it back all the way to the constituent elements. And then from that information, generate what we need to generate. So they're not actually focused on generating SBOMs directly, but more as in providing information to very precisely provide information that could be used as part of an SBOM generation story. Fascinating work. It's actually, I was really enjoying attending the calls, and then they changed the time, and I haven't been able to rejoin. Fascinating. Lots of actual computer science in there. So summary, we have lots of tools. This is just scratching the surface. There's lots of potential. We're still hopeful for some kind of one-stop shopping solution, but ultimately, I think automation is going to provide some part of SBOMs, but we're looking likely at hybrid solutions, and at least in the intermediate term. And if you're not following Tracy on Twitter, you probably should. You'll learn an awful lot. This little gem, she dropped this little gem a few days ago, that SBOM is a big data problem. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it the way that she does, but the way that I interpret this expression is, once we have these, what are we going to do with them? And I think that's where she's nodding. So that's where I think that's where we actually start having an interesting problem. Is once we have all of these, then what? But anyway, so this is kind of where we are in terms of providing services to our projects in the SBOM realm. Mikhail has some related work that he's doing that I'll ask him to come back and talk about on some future call. Again, SBOMs have, when we started doing this work, we were thinking about them entirely as intellectual property, license and copyright tracking, but they've become so much more than that. And again, we've expanded our scope on them. Anyway, with that, I'm going to stop the recording and end the formal portion of this and open it up for questions.